You could argue that if the best way to portray the real in fiction were just to echo the way that we experience things in life, then there would be no need for it. It wouldn't really have much of a function if it were just describing exactly what we see. You know, if it is able to emphasize some element that clarifies things or brings something out that we wouldn't otherwise notice, then it has a function as literature. Because one other thing that you mention in the essay is this claim that, realism wouldn't really have drama to it. It wouldn't have an sort of an artifice of dramatic structure to it. We were just on our film podcast, Criteria, we were just discussing this movie called Bicycle Thieves, which is a classic of, have you seen it?
I have
Bicycle
not.
Thieves?
Yeah, no, I have not.
Okay, well, it's from 1948. It's this classic of Italian neorealism, and the screenwriter, this guy Cesare Zavattini, who is one of the critics and writers and multimedia artists who was really advocating for this neorealist movement. His slogan was "Life as it is," very similar to the slogan that you were mentioning earlier in literary realism. But when the director, Vittorio De Sica, was asked why he decided to make a film about the theft of a bicycle, he said something which I think clarifies what realism can be. And he said, uncovering the drama in everyday life, the wonderful in the daily news. Mm-hmm. So it clearly shows that both wonder and drama need not be absent from a movement that calls itself realism.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I think that you're referring to a part where I was dealing with sort of Jean-Paul Sartre's position, where he of says that narrative is very different from life, and to present human life in the form of narrative is actually to falsify it, is the language that he uses. So similar to kind of the dynamic that you're describing. There are not and there cannot be any true stories, is his conclusion because of that. And I mean, I think this does raise a good objection, because if you think about the patterns that exist in stories, right? When you see the same figure showing up 3 different times at crucial moments, for example, right? Or you see the same color or the same symbol showing up 5 different times, you do begin to notice that this isn't just sort of an unmitigated apprehension of the world. This is curated for you. It's shaped and patterned, right, for you. And this is actually, again, the objection of H.G. Wells to the fiction of Henry James. He said that it was bad on the grounds that it was too patterned, right? Life, he said, should be given the preference and must not be whittled or distended for pattern's sake. But again, I mean, I think that while it is certainly the case that from a sort of God's eye view, like a deist God's eye view, it would be true that all things, the only way that we could have access to things as they really are is that we would see all things that are happening everywhere at the same time without any sort of, I guess, past or future or narrative structure, that we could just see into this multitude or this whole all at once. But that would actually also involve a kind of falsification, right? Because it would lead us away from the fact that human life does obtain a narrative structure, right? I mean, I think that we all know this from remembering what we were like when we were teenagers or 5 years old. And, you can't help but ask yourself, well, is that really the same person, right? Is that me? When I did that when I was 17, is that the same soul or the same person that is standing here before you? And we can't help but answer, well, yes. And then we have to figure out what happened that altered that 5-year-old into the 16-year-old into the 41-year-old, right? And and in order to do that, you have to trace a story. It is true that Some stories are more romantic in the sense that they falsify that narrative in order to make the pain seem less painful, or in order to load the sort of rosy vision onto the different twists and turns of outrageous fortune, so that life seems, let's say, easier or more perfectly contained than it really was. But you need not get rid of some measure of pattern in order to ascertain also as much of the real as we possibly can glean.
Right. Well, it seems like two valid approaches to realism. One of them would be to be more explicitly patterned, and another one would be to sort of portray that seeming haphazardness of life in such a way as perhaps subtly and perhaps with somewhat invisibly has a pattern to it.
Yeah.
And that would also be a valuable service.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I address something of what you're getting at now in the distinction that I make between ambivalence and mystery. And that ambiguity, excuse me, mystery, and the regular realists, at least many of them, if you look at the sort of what their observations amount to, oftentimes you'll find a real kind of almost principled ambiguity, right? In other words, they start out by saying that the goal of the artist is to eliminate his own preferences and feelings and opinions, to diminish all of that and just be an observer and then report on it. But then when they report back, the contents of that report involve this claim that the world is filled with all of these ambiguities, right? That is almost like the heart of reality is ambiguity, and just a sort of a deferral of the possibility of meaning, a delay of the possibility of meaning, so that anytime we find supposed meaning, that's really just a projection or a superimposition that we've sort of forced upon it. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have kind of mystery, a commitment to mystery, which is that, yes, it seems like when this character's life took a particular turn, that it really didn't lead them anywhere fruitful or significant, right? And it looks like they actually walked right down a blind alley. But in fact, later on in the novel, let's say maybe in the second to last scene, you find that earlier incident where they walked down a blind alley had a greater weight of meaning that was only, right, sort of visible later on. And so it's not that I'm saying that there aren't ambiguities in our world, or that we don't bump up against them, even every day. We do, especially because we're limited human beings and we can't make sense of everything. We don't have the wisdom, right, to see the whole, to put all of the pieces together all the time. But just because we don't have the wisdom and to be able to put the pieces together all the time doesn't mean that we can't put the pieces together much of the time, or some of the time at least, right? And so I would argue that a novel is best when it sort of allows both to exist, so that you're not claiming that all there is ambiguity, or that all there is mystery, that there's some measure of resolution, and then there's also a shroud or an aura of that which is undiscovered